think that it's time to begin our mini plenary session. My name is Francisco Lara, and I am the moderator of the session. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm sure we're going to have a very exciting session with very interesting presentation and intense discussion or conversation at the end. Welcome, everybody. We have 1 hour and a half. We have 3 presentations. We're going to start with the presentation by Dali Sambold-Rock from the University of Alaska. And then we're moving to Sarababu Rabia with the Ben-Gurion University. And finally, we're going to have a Zoom presentation by Jeff Garno Habidu Cortazo. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, I'm trying my best. So those are the 3 presentations that we have today. What we're going to do is to give each of the presenters 20 minutes. So we use the first hour for presentations and then the last 30 minutes of the session for questions and conversation. So we are starting with Indigenous Peoples and Territory, Misalignment and Reality by Dali Sambold-Rock from the University of Alaska. 20 minutes.
Okay, Diana, thank you very much. Allow me first of all to express my thanks and gratitude to Professors David Newman, Heather Nickel, and in particular, Emmanuel Grenay-Jadi, and the financial support that he provided through University of Victoria to allow me to join you here today to share with you my remarks. So it will be a combination of my PowerPoint presentation and some written remarks so I don't get distracted and come within the 20 minutes that we've been allotted. I'm an Inuk from Alaska. I don't do borderland studies. I just came from the session on border culture and found that quite illuminating. So I'm going to speak to you really as a subject of border culture. And by that, I mean the perspectives of my own people and the borders that have been imposed upon us. This is a map that illustrates our traditional environment, our traditional territory, spreading from Chukotka in the Russian Far East, across Alaska, throughout all of Canada and Greenland. You can tell that we occupy a vast territory in the circumpolar Arctic world. And obviously our people, approximately 180,000 of them, inhabit Russia, United States, Canada, and Greenland / Denmark. This is significant. In the earliest days, Evan Hobson, the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the international Indigenous peoples organization of our people, sought funding to bring our people together across the imposed national boundaries. And in the funding application, he stated some very important things. We, Eskimo, are an international community sharing common language, culture, and a common land along the Arctic coast of Siberia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Although not a nation state, as a people, we do constitute a nation. If you think about that in terms of borders, this is quite significant in and of itself. But he continued in this proposal. This is important not because nationalism solves problems. We know otherwise, right? But because our common nationality is the basis of our present attempt to find solutions to our common age-old problem of survival. Our communities are old. Point Hope, for instance, is a village in which our people have lived for over 3,000 years. But national boundaries imply concepts which have had no place in our society, where sharing is a large part of our secret of survival in the Arctic. For thousands of years, we were people without national boundaries. Rather, we were people of our land, cold and dark most of the time, and other people did not covet our lands. We know things are dramatically different today. Fortunately, Hobson was successful in raising the funding to bring our people, our direct blood relations from Chakaka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland together. Unfortunately, at the opening conference, in his welcoming address, he noted that geostrategic and geopolitical issues have stifled the participation of our direct blood relations, the Siberian Yupik in Chakaka. One of the four flags across the Arctic is badly missed today. But at least in Denmark, Canada, and the United States, it's generally agreed that we enjoy certain Aboriginal rights. And as Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, it's crucial for the status of these rights to be uniformly respected. And to secure this agreement, we have to organize, unite, and negotiate for it. And that it's necessary to ensure successful protection of our mutual Arctic environmental security. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council was formed in June of 1977. This in and of itself is significant because today, every other country on Earth, far from the Arctic, seem to be busy writing Arctic security strategies, Arctic policies. Well, I have to say, as the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we were the first to put forward the objective of developing an Arctic policy, and this is in the 1970s. At the conference in June of 1977 in our northernmost community of Utqiagvik in Alaska, delegates adopted Resolution 7713 among many others. Whereas we Inuit are the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and we have freely visited and traded back and forth across our homelands for thousands of years, thus establishing our Aboriginal rights to free and unrestricted travel and trading all across the Arctic. Be it resolved that the delegates assembled at the first ICC call upon the governments of Canada, the United States, and Denmark to negotiate an agreement that will protect for all Inuit the right to unrestricted trade and travel. This objective remains central to the work of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Clearly, that objective is sourced in the right of self-determination. All peoples have the right of self-determination. I was fortunate to be involved in the negotiation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That human rights standard setting exercise took place from 1982 until it was finally adopted 25 years later by the UN General Assembly in September 2007. Article 3 of the UN Declaration affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. This language is the same language that can be found in Article 1 of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. My main point here is that the right affirmed in the UN Declaration is exactly the same and full right as recognized in international law that attaches to all peoples, including Indigenous peoples. Here, the preambular paragraph of the UN Declaration says some important things about the right of self-determination being inherent or pre-existing. And for our purposes, it's necessary to ensure that this right, which derives from our political, economic, and social structures and from our cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, that they also attach to our rights to lands, territories, and resources. I could give you a full lecture on the content of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but time doesn't permit that. The main point here is that these rights are inherent or pre-existing in our legal status as Indigenous peoples. They're not given by others. And in fact, they were pre-existing well before the national borders that have been imposed on the homelands by the states that have grown up and around us. In order to safeguard this expression of the right of self-determination, we had to negotiate over that 25-year period with governments who found it indigestible to attach the right of self-determination as understood in international law to us as Indigenous peoples. The United States was running around like the sky was falling. I mean, it was a difficult and challenging negotiation. So we invoked the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We weren't even parties to the CERD Convention. It's one of the few international human rights instruments that includes a definition of its subject matter. Here, it's important to note that any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life is prohibited. It's essentially, this is the norm as established by CERD. The UN Declaration includes important balancing provisions. Article 1 takes into account our distinct cultural context by recognizing our collective rights. Of course, we all have individual human rights. Every one of us in this room enjoys, should enjoy individual human rights. But it's notable that the collective rights of Indigenous peoples is underscored. Article 2 reinforces that we have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination. Think about that again in the context of our right of self-determination. For those of you familiar with public international law, you may be aware that there are peremptory norms in international law. The prohibition against racial discrimination is one of those peremptory norms. You're familiar with genocide, you're familiar with slavery, you're familiar with other peremptory norms, again, or jus cogens. And here, we brought the argument forward as Inuit to say that we won't tolerate racial discrimination in the context of the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and especially in relation to the exercise and enjoyment of our right of self-determination. I could go into this, and in fact, I was hoping that Marcelos and the other colleague that spoke about public international law the other day would entertain a debate about this particular issue, but I'll set that aside. States also tried to use Article 4 to stifle or diminish the right of self-determination and its attachments to Indigenous peoples. One trick they tried was just taking this article and moving it closer up to Article 3, thinking that, okay, we can affirm the right of self-determination, but let's say it only applies to internal and local affairs. Come on, we're brighter than that. It didn't work. Of course we have the right of self-government, the right to autonomy. We've been exercising measures of social control within our own societies and with our own protocols long before nation states emerged, right? I mean, never mind 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia. We were doing this for centuries. So it was a kind of a dubious trick that they were trying to play in this regard. And of course, it was shut down fairly immediately. And seemed logical. Article 3 affirms our right of self-determination. Article 4 affirms our right to autonomy and self-government. One of the other arguments we made to counter this is that we're both domestic actors as well as international actors. I know we have our own measures and means for local control and the business of our internal affairs, but at the same time, we're international subjects. We got busy and we're engaged in UN, the Organization of American States, the International Labor Organization. We're busy within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Everyone knows here about the impacts that we're seeing across the Arctic and our traditional territories because of climate change. We're involved in the International Maritime Organization because of our reliance upon the marine environment. We're one of the few Indigenous peoples organizations, in fact, the only one involved in the negotiations of the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement that involves 10 different states, including the 5 Arctic littoral states. Turning to borders, Article 36 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples addresses borders, indicating Indigenous peoples, in particular those divided by international borders, have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes with their own members as well as other peoples across borders. This is huge. It's significant that states have an obligation to work in consultation and collaboration with us to realize the implementation of this particular right. Allow me to point out quickly that the same right is reflected in the ILO Convention number 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. This is the only legally binding international instrument specifically addressing Indigenous people. Unfortunately, only 22 states have ratified the instrument, but it's also important to know that the United Nations itself has recognized this convention as mutually reinforcing and complementary. Also, the Organization of American States has adopted the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it too is mutually reinforcing and complementary. So this trilogy of international Indigenous human rights instruments is quite significant, and all of them, again, address the issue of borders. Maybe I should withhold commentary on the principle of territorial integrity. This was used also by UN member states to try to stifle and diminish the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination. Essentially, in terms of the international legal order, states were trying to confine us to their prescriptive elements of exercising autonomy and self-government by using the principle of territorial integrity. And I simply want to say on this point, and we could have an entire semester on just this issue alone, right? If you think about it against the backdrop of borders, I just want to say that the principle of territorial integrity is a state-to-state obligation. It does not affect groups, peoples, or persons. And the state attempt to diminish our right of self-determination can be found in Article 46 of the UN Declaration. So now there's a lot of concern about how this ambiguity of the insertion of the terms group, people, or persons in a principle that is long-standing that states can invoke at any point in time. And of course, we weren't involved in any of that negotiation. That was state-to-state business, and it remains state-to-state business. What about the integrity of our traditional territories? This is key. This is essential. And if we think about the objectives of the Inuit Circumpolar Council to transcend all the borders that have been imposed in order to safeguard our own security, our own territorial integrity. And here I want to just point out the misalignments that have emerged, the geopolitical dimensions. The present Russia-Ukraine conflict has put a wedge between our communications with our own membership in Jakarta and their communication to the rest of the Inuit world. There are numerous environmental threats that need to be addressed, but we have the uneven treatment and behavior of even the 5 Arctic states in relation to climate change, in relation to, and this is really important because all of these rights are interrelated, interdependent, interconnected, and indivisible. So if you start messing around with one set of rights or cluster of rights, it has impacts on all others. So state behavior on climate change is going to impact our food security and our food sovereignty. Economic forces. This is another huge area that I believe there is extraordinary misalignment. The behavior of, especially the Arctic states, look at what Russia is doing just in terms of development along their entire Arctic coastline, and all the other social considerations, whether it's infrastructure deficit, the delivery of health, the delivery of education. There's so many areas where there is misalignment. But I want to point out, and I'm just going to skip through this slide because I have only a minute left. We've made extraordinary advances utilizing these human rights instruments. I want to point out the Hans Island Agreement, one of the most recent boundary agreements. In fact, it's hot off the press, basically. And it's significant that between Canada and Denmark, over this area of the Lincoln Sea, that they've also agreed upon our continued access to and freedom of movement on the entirety of the area, including hunting, fishing, and related cultural, traditional, and other activities. So this freedom of movement that we identified in 1977 has actually been crystallized in this particular agreement. Another project that we're involved in is Savajuak, or the Pikyala-Suisuak. It's an area between Canada and Denmark that has many of the same features. Essentially, we want to ensure Inuit ownership, control, and management of this area, which we've traditionally occupied and utilized for survival, that age-old problem that Evan Hobson spoke of. One of the key features of this project is freedom of movement and travel by Inuit between Canada and Denmark. And there is an appetite on the part of governments to embrace that particular provision. We have an opportunity now with this current government of Canada to align the objectives of the UN Declaration with Canada's National Immigration and Refugee Protection Act policy. Those of you from Canada are aware that this current government is committed to realizing the rights that have been affirmed in the UN Declaration. So I've run through this quickly, but obviously these international human rights instruments are significant. We have spent our time influencing the content of these international human rights instruments, but now we're trying to breathe life into them to ensure implementation consistent with and aligned with our own worldviews and perspectives. It's been recognized, the UN Declaration, as well as these other international human rights instruments that speak specifically to Indigenous peoples, as one of the most astonishing developments in the history of modern international human rights law. I couldn't agree more. And thankfully, there is a constant progressive development of international law. And we're going to be around long enough to continue influencing this dynamic in order to ensure that we can achieve that objective of freedom of movement across our traditional territory and everything embedded in our cultural identity. Diana, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it was really illuminating and thank you for bringing this topic to the association. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can learn from this. So just to continue and optimize our time, I'm going to ask Sarah Babu Rabia to present her work on epistemology of surveillance, Palestinian indigenous researchers in Israel academia. 20 minutes.
Sorry, the two people online are able to watch only to not directly the screen. Is it possible to do something?
We don't know.
You can do share screen for everybody.
I just shared screen.
For everybody. Maybe I'll get
Maybe add the slideshow.
Now?
No.
No.
On the security.
Good, there you go.
Because you have the security camera. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Here Zoom. The Zoom is not open at all?
Yes, the other one is.
No, click on the picture, not on this. Click on the picture. Put it full screen, the picture.
Then I need, you need a technician, but I don't want to get out.
Yeah, that's right.
No,
Make it bigger.
camera is off, try video.
Camera is off. No, but
That's
you need the,
Share.
you need the share screen.
Share screen over there.
No, but you need on the security. Yes. And then it's to share screen. Then now everybody can share the screen. Okay, that's it. Now you can go to.
All right.
I'll just make sure with them that they can see it online.
Are you?
No, it's the same like in the previous time. We see the room, but not directly the presentation.
You still have to share the screen. Actually,
Yeah, I share the screen with everybody.
Okay, if it is a problem,
Yeah, thank you.
I think you can just press share.
Yeah, I think if you do, yes, and then you choose.
Can you see it now?
yeah,
Great, wonderful. Good.
yes, thank you very much.
Right?
Yes. Thank you.
I didn't realize I knew until I started.
Yeah, it's all. Thank you, Emmanuel. All right, we're ready.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Didn't realize it was not paying. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Baburbeak-Weder. I am a sociologist of education myself. I'm indigenous subject of my studies as well. And Palestinian, indigenous, Bedouin from Israel. And the topic that I choose, it is actually a very challenging topic that we rarely discuss in the academia, at least in the Israeli academia. So I'm really thankful for the invitation to present this challenging topic to become more visible. Epistemology of surveillance, it was published by the Sociology of Education last year. I will talk about the epistemology of surveillance among Palestinian researchers in Israeli academia. My argument here is that it explores the hidden racialized mechanisms of surveillance in the field of knowledge production experienced among Palestinian researchers in Israeli academia. I argue that gatekeepers of Israeli academia seek to eliminate the indigenous epistemology through mechanisms of hidden surveillance used to control them as colonized subjects, unable to challenge the Zionist ideology that is an essential aspect of Israeli academia. The current paper aims to unpack these invisible mechanisms of surveillance, which are part of the broader colonial apparatus aiming to maintain not only territorial sovereignty, but also epistemological sovereignty. I will use three bodies of literature: settler colonialism and surveillance, coloniality of knowledge, and the colonial apparatus of Israeli academia. Regarding settler colonialism and mechanisms of surveillance, settler colonialism has been defined as a structure directed toward establishing sovereignty and property rights over lands and territory through the logic of eliminating the natives. This objective is achieved through deploying tools of biopolitics aimed at the administration and regulation of the population as individuals and collectives. These include practices of correction, exclusion, normalization, disciplining, selection, and elimination. Foucault refers to three meanings of biopower: sovereign power, indirect forms of violence, and discipline mechanisms, a series of techniques by which the body's operation can be controlled, and I will exemplify it through my research. The aim of discipline mechanism is to achieve more efficient forms of discipline, one that reaches the soul, to control the personality and the consciousness, facilitating new possibilities for punishment. Surveillance in Israel-Palestine, it aims to secure the support of the Israeli regime and to preserve the dominance over the entire territory in dispute. I refer here to two concepts: normalizing surveillance, which aims to normalize colonization and domination, and exclusionary surveillance that uses power knowledge technologies as means of exclusion. It does not include corrective normalizing features, and it contains no right behavior, rather the opposite. Those apparatuses are intended to make their subject fail so as to prove their inability to be included, making it nearly impossible for the control population to behave correctly. The third is the coloniality of knowledge. It's a form of surveilling and controlling indigenous and non-white minorities, a mechanism for facilitating the expansion of the colonial body over the rest of the world. It reproduces the imperial project of modernity through the organization and dissemination of epistemic material and aesthetic resources. Coloniality of knowledge justifies itself through the coloniality of being. This epistemic strategy is founded on the continuous production and dehumanized subjectivities grounded in racialized notions of native indolence, immorality, and savagery. The coloniality of knowledge has three mechanisms: epistemicide, the colonizer kills and displays pre-existing knowledge; ontological exclusion, whereby the Black or native in the eyes of the conqueror has no valuable ontology; and co-opting, by denying the colonized access to the dominant knowledge, Western knowledge becomes desirable. This hierarchy of knowledge is manifested by the paradigm of desirable European knowledge and irrelevant and illegitimate Eastern knowledge. Coloniality of knowledge and the universities. Universities, or the academia in general, they are bearers of the colonial knowledge and coloniality. By legitimizing particular forms of knowledge and ontologies, universities are deeply implicated in coloniality. They were part of the parcel of the colonial project knowledge production. It is a canon, disregarded other epistemic traditions. It is a canon that tries to portray colonialism as a normal form of social relations between human beings rather than as a system of exploitation and oppression. Decolonizing the university. Ryan Olofsson argues in this regard that in order to decolonize the universities, there is a need to decolonize the mind. Decolonization of the mind is when African or indigenous researchers search and study the concepts from their own perspective and not from the Western perspective. The coloniality of the knowledge focuses on teasing out epistemological issues, politics of knowledge generation, as well as question of who generates which knowledge and for what purpose. Israeli academia has played a key role in establishing and serving the Zionist project in Palestine, Israel, both before and after the establishment of the state, working on providing it with knowledge and mechanisms that have helped in institutionalizing state control of all civil and military fields, such as building, planning, settlement, as well as regarding the construction of identity and memory. Anat Matar has defined Israeli university. She asked, what is the role of the intellectual who ask for the truth? Universities in our times choose oppressive practices in the booth of liberal rhetoric. Academic freedom nowadays is the freedom for not asking disturbing questions. So, methodology. I relied on semi-structures, interviews, the total number, by the way, of the Palestinian researchers, faculty, academic faculty in all 7 Israeli universities does not pass the 3%. And I could find only those who agreed, only 15 people who agreed to be interviewed on their experience as academic in Israeli universities from the different universities, mainly from humanities, social science, and architecture. And part of them, some of them told me that they're not willing to be interviewed because they fear of being revealed. And this is also part of the findings. So the findings actually refer to unmarked forms of discipline and punishment, which refers to normalizing epistemology. And I divided the findings into 3 main themes: dividing as a tool to normalize epistemology, dividing academic knowledge into political versus apolitical, symbolic violence, and use the tenure as a tool for control. What is political versus apolitical? One of the mechanisms perpetuating colonial relations of domination is created by the binary division that classifies superior as opposed to inferior categories of knowledge. Within the framework of academia, where knowledge production is supervised, key players in the academic institution create categories that classify political knowledge containing critical terminology, posing a symbol threat to existing power relations between settler and colonized. Apolitical knowledge, on the other hand, eliminate decolonial critical language symbols and images of the colonized. Ines, a senior lecturer, says, sorry, I hardly can see anything. As long as I wrote on cultural impact, and Ines is a woman, is a female lecturer. Here I also didn't mention some, because there are very few in all universities, I even couldn't mention what their field of study, because they might be revealed. Some of them, if there are many in their own field, you will hear the field. So Ines says, as long as I wrote on cultural and patriarchal oppression, it's a wow. But the minute you start to even name Arab women as Palestinian, they start to blame you. Wait, this is political. Her work is political. She is not an academic. Here I started to experience the limitation of Israeli academia. As a researcher who studies Arab women, there is an expectation to conduct research from a cultural prism to examine the cultural problems as detached from the political situation. And when you examine those power structures, suddenly challenge them, challenge the power relations, because you put a mirror in front of those who hold the power. Essam describes the dilemma he faces in his field. I had a huge conflict about the subject of my research, the subject I want to explore. I really wanted to explore the status of minorities, the state of planning under occupation in Jerusalem, all the links between politics and planning, the things that are deep down in planning, policies, and space and politics. But after receiving some piece of advice, I turned to study sustainability, which is far from Israel, from the Palestinians, and from minorities. Symbolic violence. This is the second tool. The sanction of oppositional political knowledge is conducted through hidden messages of symbolic violence, which is manifested in the form of academic advice from senior Jewish faculty to junior Palestinian faculty. One of such pieces of advice repeated by the interviewees, and especially by the young female researchers, was that they should not write about controversial issues such as the national or the political oppression, but rather about the cultural oppression of Palestinian women. Reem, a senior lecturer, says, the dean told me, you will pay dearly. You better write on violence against women and not on political or controversial topics. And choose a subject with less trouble. Iyad, a professor of social work, we have a lot of professors into social work, also refers to the hidden messages he received from a senior faculty when he was a junior lecturer. They told me, don't write about this topic, don't participate in TV interviews, don't write in Hebrew, don't write in Arabic, don't write in political issues, don't write about problematic issues. Sanctioning the political production of knowledge is a way to guarantee domination and normalizing epistemology. Alia refers to this kind of normalizing as a mentality of a checkpoint. She says, I can check you with regard to every single aspect. Tenure. Tenure is another surveillance mechanism directed to keeping colonial epistemology as the norm. Foucault claims that status is another unit in the process of surveillance. Status is the place that a subject occupies within a hierarchy classification, tracing the normal and the abnormal. Suad recalls, you are always under this threat of not receiving a tenure. This threat is always in the air and is affected my writing a lot. You do not want to hurt yourself. Even if this is an academy, it is an academy that limits you. Adam, a senior faculty member, is. I mean, I could have chosen to write and publish on political issues, but then I will have to face sanctions such as non-promotion and not receiving a tenure. Okay, academic freedom. According to Foucault, these disciplinary methods create a linear time directed toward a final and stable point, which he describes as a developmental time in terms of advancement. These methods express the hidden messages that advancement in the correct direction depends on producing the right knowledge. The 10-year establishment symbolizes the reward embedded within the disciplinary mechanism. It does not only punish by lowering subjects in their status, but also rewarding them through elevated rank. Ruba, a senior faculty member in the field of social science, makes a link between the academic freedom to write and to struggle and the struggle to make your voice heard as a Palestinian. He says, there is no academic freedom for marginalized groups. There is no academic freedom. It is fighting for your academic freedom, about the discourse you write, about the knowledge you produce, about the terminology you use. This is exactly the fight for academic freedom. It is part of our struggle as a minority for our position, our voice, the issues that represent us, that challenge the hegemony. They are destabilizing, of course. They are threatening, but we want this space to accept you. And finally, the result is 5 minutes. Okay, I will try. The docile researcher, the permanent subject. The success of the act of surveillance is evident in the self-discipline the Palestinian researchers impose on themselves, what Foucault calls hierarchical observation, the constant possibility of observation of someone seeing you without being seen themselves, which leads to the internalization of self-discipline. Sari, a senior researcher, recalls, it does not help. The Palestinian researcher is always the other. He will never be part of the us. The Arabic researcher is always under suspicion. You must prove every day that you did not commit any crime. Even if you did not commit any crime, you still must prove. It will not help you. It doesn't help. You always have to prove that you're innocent. Maybe it's the mentality of the oppressed. That they have to prove that they didn't commit any mistake, that they are innocent. Maybe it is required from them. It also moves to disciplining the next generation. Self-discipline is evident when it is transmitted to the next generation of potential academic Palestinian researcher students who are supervised by senior researchers. Walid discusses the success of eliminating Palestinian terminology in order not to cause problems among his master's degree students. He quoted a definition from the Nakba. I took it out. I took out some words. I wanted him to succeed. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want anyone to criticize. What is he writing? How does he write? He is against the state. He is only a student. I had to watch him. He was supervised at first. I erased his entire identity from the thesis. I eliminated him. I trampled over him so he would be seen as be objective. I actually did it. The price of self-disciplining, Walid is able to reflect fully about this price. He said, I have harmed myself. I did some damage by not speaking freely in research. I have been trying all the time to narrow down, not to break the line, not to enter the political world. It is a mistake that you oppress your creation, oppress the power of creativity and clear academic writing, oppress the connection to what you are doing. So to summarize, I will refer to 3 books or 3 concepts from these 3 researchers. You can just find it. Okay. Sorry, I will read. Revealing the hidden voices of those suffering from injustice and oppression is a small part of a larger process, what de Souza describes as creating the epistemologies of the South, seeking to decolonize the Eurocentric colonial paradigm. Epistemologies of the South are concerned with the production and validation of knowledges anchored in the experience of resistance of all those social groups that have systematically suffered injustice, oppression, and destruction caused by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Knowledge production of the South cannot be separated from social and political struggle. It was born through struggle and represents the struggle. In the case at hand, the struggle is over the recognition and validation of indigenous knowledge, challenging the domination and surveillance mechanisms that work to eliminate indigenous knowledge as non-existent. This epistemicide is a colonial mechanism directed toward disempowering indigenous societies, rendering them incapable of representing their words. The goal of this epistemicide is providing a self-fulfilling colonial narrative as the only valid narrative. De Souza claims that the sociology of absence, turning absent subject into present, is a condition for validating knowledge that cannot support the reinvention of social emancipation or liberation. This duality, liberal rhetoric from outside, illiberal practices on the inside, enables the successful of the surveillance mechanism to work in the academia. The notion that enables this mechanism to remain untraceable is that they operate on the soul level, which includes the structuring of feeling and consciousness. This way, discipline and punishment remain in the private and not in the public zone. The idea of training, self-discipline, directed to creating a subject who obeys without questions, makes punishment transparent. The punishment itself is hidden, implemented through the training of the subject. As a result, it is a subject and not the sovereign who becomes seen. These unmarked forms of power benefits the academic institution in its effort to deny and hide the epistemology of surveillance enforced on the Palestinian scholars. Indeed, Foucault describes the swarming of disciplinary mechanisms to create disciplinary society, a sort of social quarantine or a mechanism of panopticism, or occupying a mentality of a checkpoint in Israeli academia for these researchers become a modern prison where they are observed and their knowledge is revealed. Voicing this epistemic critique by revealing the hidden mechanisms of surveillance is an act of resisting and cognitive liberation from this academic prison, and thus part of the global movement of decolonization. Thank you.
Let's move quickly to the next presentation. The next presentation is via Zoom. We have Jeff Gano-Halido from Stasel. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Very well. Let me see if I can
Okay.
make your presentation available. You can share your screen. There you go. Let me.
We see it online. We see it.
Yes. Can you see it? Can you see it there?
We see, but the room is watching the previous one. We are
okay.
Let me see if I can grab it here now. Not yet.
Statement. I think have my email from
Where is
but
it?
I put
It's
it
over here. All right. There you go. There you go. Yes. Yes. All right. Go ahead.
There we go. Okay. Osio Negada, Jeff Gano-Halido, Corntassel Dagodoa, Shalagia Yete, Guenasai. So, hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm coming to you from the unceded Nisqually territory on the west coast of Turtle Island. And sorry I can't be there in person, but really appreciated the excellent presentations by my colleagues Daly and Sarab. So thank you for that. I'm also part of the 21st Century Borders project with Emmanuel. So heading up Pillar 1, and this is kind of a sample of the work that we're going to be doing over the next several years. So, you know, I think a lot of the work that we're starting with is really about Indigenous conceptions of the international and how that often differs from the countries that host us as Indigenous peoples. It's an emerging field, I would say, that has been led by people like Leanne Simpson, Manuela Peak, and some of the work by myself and others, but really building off a previous literature and previous activism by George Manuel and Postlins, their 1974 piece on the Fourth World, as well as Haudenosaunee activism, and even going back to the 1920s and Descahe and his trip to Geneva as part of the emerging field of Indigenous internationalism. And when we think about different expressions of the international, and as Daly pointed out so well, we're often viewed as domestic and international actors. In this case, I'm looking at the ways in which we're inherently international, and oftentimes that international status or that international expression is not always legible or even recognized by the state. But we also have different ways of acting on these Indigenous internationalisms through treaties, through different trade networks, through even different protocols and practices. So in this case, Kaho'olawe is an island off of the coast of Maui, and Kaho'olawe was used as a bombing range by the U.S. Navy for over 50 years. And really, it was one of the kind of focal points of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement in the 1970s in order to reclaim this territory. It was eventually reclaimed, and by the 1990s, it was put into a trust status. When we visited Kaho'olawe, we had to learn a chant in order to go onto the island. And so you can imagine we're on fishing boats. We have all of our belongings packed in plastic bags, and we have to sing this chant correctly, or else we're not going to gain entry. And so singing our way onto the island becomes an important expression of Indigenous internationalism. The island itself has agency, has the final determination in terms of whether or not we're going to enter that space. This is really honoring the work of Leanne Simpson, but thinking about this as a form of nationhood or an expression of nationhood. And ultimately, our self-determining authority as Indigenous peoples is rooted in those relationships that we hold so dear. It's, as Simpson points out, Anishinaabe scholar, are complex ways of relating to plant nations, animal nations, and the spiritual realm. Our existence has always been inherently international, regardless of how rooted in place we are. And so I'm interested in the ways in which we express or demonstrate our inherent international kind of status as Indigenous peoples. And if we think about different ways of knowing, different ways of honoring these sacred relationships, and you could think of nationhood as being at the core of this. Those interrelated aspects of our language, our land and water, our ceremonial cycles, our sacred living histories, all of those things that come together to really form the crux of our nationhood, our identity as Indigenous peoples. And these are things that are grounded in those relational responsibilities. We're acting for nations and with nations. Daley has already pointed this out, so I'm not going to really belabor this, but, UNDRIP and, of course, the DRIPA, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which has gone into place in the province of BC, and then, of course, in 2019, and then, of course, the DRIPA Act that is federal as well in Canada, are attempts to grapple with how do we harmonize the principles of UNDRIP with the laws of Canada, but ultimately, how are the rights of Indigenous peoples in terms of being able to join and to maintain their self-determining authority, even when bisected by state borders. This early or recent hunting case that highlights or maybe gives us clues about the ways that this can be applied, especially around hunting rights. In 2010, a member of the Lakes tribe was hunting elk and shot elk in what was the boundary of British Columbia. He was arrested, and basically this brought forward a court case around whether or not Indigenous rights traverse the U.S. and Canadian border. Ultimately, the court found that there are Indigenous rights, and the exercise of those rights extend into Canada, even if you're considered a U.S. citizen, based on the Constitution, based on those principles. You can think of other ways, of course, this is a work in progress with the Nordic Sami Convention, but how the rights of Sami peoples, for example, traverse the states of Finland, Norway, and Sweden. in terms of not only mobility, but also the exercise of self-determining authority to all Sami. And then there are other ways that are a little bit more subtle, if you will. These are poles, and we could think of poles as silent ambassadors, as my late colleague Tamasing Tut has called them. These are some poles that greet you at the Victoria Airport in British Columbia, but these are also important boundary markers. In a lot of cases, they effectively demarcate the territory of those nations. They also provide that living history, through the poles and through the stories that are related to those poles and their sovereign crested authority. That is, they are representative of that authority, that self-determination that's present as part of those indigenous nations. So there's a lot more going on than simply a work of art. We're actually thinking of these as my colleague Tamasing Tut referred to them as silent ambassadors. You can also think of other boundary markers, the ways that natural boundaries have been formed. This is a boundary marker in Oklahoma, where a tree has been modified, culturally modified, to point out a particular trail. And a lot of our boundaries, I'm part of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, but a lot of our boundaries point towards water, right? And so these boundary markers are another important aspect of Indigenous internationalism. They highlight the ways in which we have those relationships to place, but also the ways in which we express our boundaries, and even, in this case, thinking of boundaries as lines of stewardship, lines of responsibility, rather than lines of exclusion. These are places that are protected and honored, and they're guided by protocol and principle. You can also think about trade networks. That's an important aspect in throughout Turtle Island and of course throughout the world, on the different ways that we express those trade networks through our economies. One of the prevalent ways was through Ulican in the northern part of Turtle Island here, and it was often referred to as the grease trail. But the grease from the Ulican fish, which you see on the left, the candlefish or the Ulican, is a prized possession, and has been traded and continues to be traded throughout these different networks. You can think of other ways that food and other items are traded as expressions of Indigenous internationalism, as expressions of our self-determining authority. We also have ways of expressing our solidarities as Indigenous peoples. This happens to be at Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is a sacred island, or a sacred mountain, and one of the highest mountains in the world. If you actually measure it from beneath below the water, and this was basically a camp that was gathered to protect that mountain from encroachment from a proposed 30-meter telescope. That's been this is still a work in progress, in the sense that this 30-meter telescope is still being challenged by Kanaka Maoli. But what was notable is that Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, were not only lined up on this road to prevent any encroachment onto their territory, onto their Aina, but also all of the other Indigenous peoples that visited this territory and expressed their solidarity, often through flags. And so this is when I was there in 2020. The camp has since been disbanded, but the the movement to protect this territory, to protect Mauna Kea, continues. And we can think of treaties as probably the most overt way of expressing not only our self-determining authority, but our inherent internationalism. And this is the Heltzig and Haida Treaty, which was really the first time that these two nations had signed agreements in over 50 years. And basically they signed it to protect the herring from encroachment by commercial fisheries. And so, again, it was coming together to honor that relationship, that sacred relationship to herring between these two nations. Some of you may have heard about the Buffalo Treaty or the Bison Treaty that was signed by Blackfeet nations in 2014 across the US and Canadian border. And this was a treaty for and by the Buffalo. And Leroy Little Bear and others were the primary architects of this agreement. It started with 8 signatories, and now it has, and it's renewed each year. And now it has just about, I think it has over 50 signatories to this treaty. And this is a treaty to honor that relationship to the Buffalo and to honor that I guess that vitally important aspect of Blackfeet culture as linked to the health and well-being of the bison. And again, this is annually there are ceremonies to revitalize or to renew this treaty, and it's really about taking those boundaries away in the sense of erasing maybe state boundaries or going beyond the state in the sense of focusing on Indigenous nationhood. And you can think about also, that states have been invited to be part of this treaty, but they have chosen not to, right? So in this case, this is a treaty centered on and for and by Indigenous nations. For the protection of buffalo. And finally, I'll close with just 2 more slides here, but the Gitxsan in British Columbia, so-called British Columbia, issued basically a declaration to protect their home territory in 2022, stating that they're inseparable from their homelands. And it was grounded in Gitxsan law. It's grounded in this notion that our inherent laws, the inherent laws of Gitxsan peoples, are really based on responsibilities to future generations. And so it's a way of decentering the state, decentering the provincial laws, and really highlighting the importance of Indigenous laws being enacted on Indigenous lands. And I'll close with this. This is a crest that was painted on the side of the Kwakwaka'wakw territory by Marianne Nicholson. I call it Awakening Memory, but it's actually untitled, but it's part of the landscape. And it's a way, Marianne has described this as a way to remind people from Kwakwaka'wakw that this is their territory, and it gives a cue in terms of the history, the boundaries, and the responsibilities to this place. To people that are not from this territory, it also serves as a striking visual cue to the sovereign crested authority of Kwakwaka'wakw peoples, but also as an important reminder and an important expression of Indigenous internationalism. So these are there so that future generations will thrive. And these expressions persist, and they continue to take on different forms and different meanings, but they are important as, I'd say, as the backbone of Indigenous nationhood and ultimately our self-determining authority. So I'll close there. Thank
you, Thank you. go directly to the questions, comments. I mean, we had 3 excellent presentations, Lee, Sarab, and Jeff. So if any of you wants to ask or comment.
Thanks very much. A great session, really. My name is Oren Yiftachel from Ben-Gurion University. I'm a colleague of Professor Sarab Barabia. And for a long time, the two of us and a few others were trying to get indigenous people in the Middle East, especially in Israel, Palestine, to be part of what the other 2 speakers, Inuit Canadian speakers, were talking about, the great progress in international law and the UNDRIP and the rights of the indigenous people that are supposedly implemented by governments. And I want to ask the 2 Canadians, Canadian Inuit, about the lack of progress in other parts of the world. One way to ask is internationalism or solidarity of indigenous people in the face of blatant refusal of states in the Middle East, especially Egypt and Israel, to recognize any of the rights, not only recognize any of the rights, recognize that the people are indigenous. I mean, Saraba Barabia is a community that is denied even the idea that they're indigenous. There is a whole industry of people saying that the Bedouin people come from Saudi Arabia, they don't belong to their homeland, they are nomad, they will continue to roam, etc., to break the connection to the land. And of course, also in Egypt, there is a lot of tension with the Bedouin people. So what do you suggest, or what do you see as the very partial application of UNDRIP and the other convention that you mentioned in many other parts of the world, and also in Africa, in India, indigenous people are still suffering colonial relations. I leave it to you to comment on that kind of reality.
You want to comment on it?
Yes, thank you for underscoring the implementation gap that exists. But this broader question of identity, I have to say that in the decades that I've been involved, and maybe it's because I've been taught by elders to take the long view, that important advances have been made. One example is the Ainu and the insistence by the government of Japan to not recognize them as indigenous peoples. And they persisted. They continued to be present, to raise their voices in international venues, particularly within the UN human rights regime. And they utilized that as a strategy. I mean, if they're there physically present in their traditional clothing, sharing their own origin legends, their own stories, their own challenges from their own perspectives, it was only a matter of time that the government of Japan had to finally say, yes, the Ainu are indigenous peoples. They've made some initial first steps to recognize important elements of their land rights. It's not comprehensive, but at least it's a first step. And that, I think that particular approach worked for them. They now have actually they've had for some time a center that focuses on all of the interrelated elements of Ainu life, the economic, social, cultural, spiritual elements of Ainu. And they utilize that center to influence policy by the government. So I think that that's one at least instructive approach, that this larger, let's just be honest, every government's a boogeyman. There's not every one of them, that not a single one of them has emerged in a way to treat indigenous peoples favorably. I mean, we could go on about the historical injustices, but I think that persistence amounts to something. And hopefully in my lifetime, we can begin to close this implementation gap. I think also examples like what is happening in Canada the state that grew up around many Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people is also instructive. And so when I find little gems like this, drawing it, shining the light on them as examples for other governments to undertake. I mean, yes, they're the only democracy that's active in adopting legislation that Jeff spoke of. I had a slide on it, but we didn't have time to drill into exactly what the government of Canada is doing or the province of BC is doing. But at least they're acknowledging the truth, right? And the existence of the people and acting on it. And so when you have favorable examples, positive examples to draw the attention of other governments to, that in and of itself is very powerful. I mean, something like the challenges of climate change and what Inuit have to offer in terms of our knowledge, our intricate knowledge about the Arctic. And again, illustrating the positive that you can contribute.
Thank you, David. Jeff, do you want to comment briefly?
I'll keep it very brief because Daly has already laid it out so nicely. Just to say that, there's no panacea here, but actually putting UNDRIP into legislation in countries has been, really the most effective because we don't have a treaty other than ILO 169. But we don't have a treaty around UNDRIP. And so, in the Philippines and Bolivia, it's been put into the constitutional provisions, and in Canada now it's being harmonized with Canadian law. So that's probably one of the most effective ways. And as Daly pointed out, that gives some avenue for mobilization and also avenue for change. But yeah, the change is slow, it's glacial, just as we saw with, leading up to the vote on UNDRIP, in 2007. I mean, it took 25 plus years, right? So it's been very slow, and I think we do have to find different ways to mobilize together.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other question, comment? Over here. Yes, and then over there. And then Elizabeth. No, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Kamila Fakowska. I'm from Poland, and I very much enjoyed all the presentations. And my comment and question is to Sorab. Thank you for this really amazing presentation, very powerful examples of people working in academia and struggling with their research and the reception of their research and their person also. And I work with Roma people, and I work with Roma academics in Poland. And this discussion that you presented very much resonates with the position of Roma academics in the academia in general, not only in Poland, but Europe and worldwide, where their presence is constantly questioned, challenged, because it is challenging the dominant hegemonic perspective of Roma, which is written by non-Roma academics, which is diverted, which is distorted, and it's pathologizing them, othering them constantly. So I wonder, I wonder, because you mentioned a situation when someone was called non-academic but a politician, or involving themselves in the political affairs. Exactly the same thing that as we are encountering in our research, with suggestions that people are using not the right methodology, not objective methodology, whereas ethnographic work that they are doing is called not objective. So I wonder whether you experience the same, because this is for me an exemplification of racialized methodologies and racial hierarchies imposed on Roma, where they have to use the objectified methods, which are non-suspicious, because otherwise they're, gypsy tricks playing on Gajo populations, non-Roma populations. So that's my question to you, one of them. And the other one is whether you, and you don't have to answer these questions if you don't like, how is your research received among the Israeli scholars and also Palestinian societies, communities?
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, I actually started this study because of my own personal experience. This is what I do in academia as an indigenous, actually using the study or the research as a platform actually to voice these hidden issues. So I started from studying Bedouin women, then studying racism in the academia. And then because of my own personal experience, when I first got my position, I had a Palestinian master's student, and she studied the indigenous young movements of struggle, political movements. And when she presented her thesis in a seminar, we both were attacked by most of the scholars. So why are you using the indigenous term? Well, it is political. This is not the topic. You should be more objective.
What, in the education department?
No, before that. No, let's not mention names of departments. On video. So it started really, I got very, very angry on, and then I had also some talks with my colleagues, very, very nice colleagues, but we have, so here, the one that were political is not me and my student. They were political. We used methodology. We used a theoretical, legitimate framework of settler colonialism, of using indigenous words. So yes, I decided to turn this into from a hidden topic into a visible topic, that we can talk about it and put it, also into public and into the scholars, into the academic stage. And I think this is also part, if I relate to Oren's question, this is also part of a general situation regarding, or the treatment regarding the indigenous Bedouin in Israel. This is part of eliminating the native, and we see it not only in research, we see it in it's a fight on narratives. Yes, it is a fight of narratives of who owns the land, who is the owner of the land. Have you been there before? No, you were not. So we're trying to. There are two concepts that I like. Re-indigenizing and de-indigenizing, and we see it in the narratives, in the memory, or in the curriculum, in the nature, in the names of the nature. So this is also part of the agenda, and the way to do it is to encounter it by research, by academic, scientific research, which is a legitimate tool in my eyes to prove that actually you exist and your narrative exists.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Yes, over there.
Yeah, thank you.
Your name?
Yefeskel from Ben-Gurion University. Also a question to Professor Abu Rabia. First of all, thank you very much for extremely enlightening presentation. Bit of a follow-up with the previous question, being a member of the group that you are researching, was there something that surprised you in your findings, something that you didn't recognize from your own experience?
Yes. yes, there was. It's a previous topic that I studied about the paradox of the professional marginality among Bedouin women in the workplace. And the thing that was surprised me is that I thought this is a different topic. You have to read the paper so to understand the context. But I thought that I'm going to. It actually was about the integration of Bedouin women, academic Bedouin women in the labor market. And I thought that I was doing research on the second generation of Bedouin women. And then I found out that they were extended first generation. It is still a first generation, which says something about the possibilities of accessing higher education and then how to translate this capital into the workplace. But it needs more time in order to elaborate on that.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Your name? Sorry.
So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm also from the academia in Israel. And I think two things that I want to mention which are more general connection to your presentation. Firstly, nowadays in the Israeli society, we become so divided also inside the Jewish society, not only between the Jewish Israeli society and the Arabian Israel society or Palestinian or whatever. So everybody become extra careful from dealing with politics. So I wonder if some of the questions that you raised and some of the some of those limitations, I assume that they might be relevant for also for Jewish Israeli scholars in many institutions today, unfortunately. Okay, so if we're talking about academic freedom, so I think if you do this research, it would be nice to check it, to do a checklist and do this, to compare. And secondly, personally, I'm familiar also with Palestinian scholars which are working out of Israel in international universities. So I think it would be also interesting to check how come they have more freedom to express themselves about those issues that you just mentioned. I know specific cases that they might be biased, over-biased, to the other side. Maybe because they feel it's a good opportunity for them, to balance. So I think this is really a very important and very complex issue, but it would be good to measure it from all sides. Okay. And one last point.
No, I have to answer you before I forget.
Yeah, but one
because you mentioned
short point, which is general about Arabic society. In our college, I'm working in Kinneret Academic College in the north of Israel, very, very small college. Most of the students are coming from the Arabic society, and we see it in many other universities. So in general, we see much more students from the Palestinian or Arabic minority in the Israeli academia.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, you'll excuse me for my answer. Okay. This conversation that your comments, it's not personal now what I'm going to do, but if I'm going to analyze it, just step out of that, zoom out, from the situation and analyze it. What was here is like a defensive comment from an Israeli scholar that here's a Palestinian scholar reflecting on the power relations. Maybe this is not what you meant, but if I analyze it, what I see here, you mentioned we have to be careful in politics. Also, non-Palestinians, also Israeli, also Jewish Israeli, people are biased or over-biased, and we have to balance. So these words actually puts or gives this knowledge, indigenous knowledge production, delegitimization. Sorry, delegitimize. Thank you. The knowledge of production and start to put it, in frameworks of being political. And what my argument is that knowledge production is not a political, is not it is part of a knowledge production of who we are. So we cannot put it in a box of being political or biased or non-professional, since we are framing it also in theoretical, sociological, wider frameworks. I argue that if we examine this phenomenon among maybe Mizrahim, maybe among other people who suffer the same suffering, maybe we will find a different, the same findings. But I think the difference is that Jewish people are part of the national collective, and the Palestinian people are not part of the national collective. And I think when Oren Iftachel writes about these issues before the current government, he will not be threatened as much as I will be threatened. And I already received, threatened from the blacklist of the radical right wings policing inside academia and outside academia. This will be my answer for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have time for a last very short question. Emmanuel, please.
So I want to comment on this panel on the three papers. First of all, I want to thank you very, very much, all three, for coming. For agreeing, I want to thank Jeff, obviously, who I depend on to actually learn and to do the work, the research work that we do. The issues that we're discussing, I think, are very deep and very, very important. We study borders. We are studying the borders of the mind when we listen to Sarah. And when we listen to Dali or to Jeff, to Dali specifically, we're looking at gatekeepers of legal international agreements that are in existence and are ignored by certain gatekeepers because they're already in place. It's not like the states do not know them. And then with Jeff, we're learning that the other, you know, the sociology of silence cited by Sarah, that's a very important work by Da Silva. It's the idea that we are not even aware of other knowledges and other representations of borders. So with this panel, I try to basically kick into that can and try to make us think outside the box. But you can touch it, how, you know, tense it can be in Israel, for instance, what we just heard, but also how tense it is between international rulemaking, the UN and Canada, and the progressive implementation of rule of law that have been defined and discussed for 25 years and are still not, you know, recognized, where governments basically decide that rather than legislate, they're going to use the court system because it's slower in the implementation of these international agreements, right? And then we still have a sociology of silence. When my colleague Jeff, for instance, had been working on this, Jeff has articles that have been published, and his colleagues, the people he cited, more than 10 years ago. But are these knowledge actually debated in our forums? Do you read their work? So that's the comment I wanted to raise. I think it's really important as scholars that we think outside the box, that we perceive, you know, when I think about borders, we tend to look at borders from a state-bound perspective. I would like us to look at the states from the bordered people's perspective, because that's where there are hundreds of millions of people today in the world that really suffer from that supposed minority situation that they have. Yet, the rule of law is there, the international agreements exist. We have found, you know, we have agreed upon principles that are just, you know, lost in sight. And that's actually why I'm really happy that we have put together these three fabulous discussions and that we have them, you know, with us today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, we had three very important presentations here. We have just 1 extra minute and lunch is waiting for us. So if you want to be brief, short.
Just a short comment that I'm part of the organizing committee, and I really want to appreciate David Newman's acceptance to have indigenous topics. It wasn't a traditional topic in border studies. When we had the first meetings, it wasn't raised and persistent. Why? Exactly because like a session, like the